Speaking of children, when my two brothers and I were growing up as kids, we experienced Christmas as a pilgrimage. My parents would pile the three of us, along with Christmas packages, luggage, and the like, for a journey over the river and through the woods to our grandparents' houses. More accurately, we would travel over interstate highways for hundreds of miles, as my grandparents lived in Michigan and Kansas. All told, we would spend about 34 hours together in the car over the holidays, traveling. The memories made on those road trips themselves were about what you would expect. Dad would try to see how far he could drive without stopping. We'd encounter snow or ice storms. Perhaps if your family has some kind of a road trip tradition, you may be able to imagine similar stories. But mostly the details of all those hours in the car were a blur of waiting and boredom. And I gotta say, this New Year's, it seemed to me like 2020 had been the world's longest road trip without any particularly happy destination. Though the beginning of 2021 perhaps contains some glimmer of hope, the prospect of the first months of this year is likely to be an awful lot like the one preceding it, unfortunately. But fortunately, for the start of this strange new year, with so much of the world's heartbreaking business as usual, today's gospel also describes a political and a social situation 2,000 years ago of more of the world's troublesome status quo. The highlights, as Luke just mentioned, an easily threatened and manipulative despot who turns to violence when thwarted. Traveling and well-intentioned scholars or seekers are at first duped and then enlightened into resistance. A family is on the run for their lives, and they're given sanctuary in a foreign land. Furthermore, not contained in today's passage is the story of Herod after he realized the Wisemen betrayed him. And wishing to eliminate this newborn political threat, ordered the slaughter of all children 2 years and younger in the Bethlehem area. As Luke said, this doesn't really make it into the Christmas pageant. It's hard not to admit that while this may not be the Christmas story we want to hear, it's a version that resonates deeply and troublingly in our own times. It's not an exact parallel, of course, and trying to make it an allegory by substituting our least favorite leaders, whoever they may be, for Herod, it really doesn't do the biblical story justice. But it is difficult to miss the resonance. We see all kinds of leaders terrified by the prospect of losing power and willing to hold on to it through almost any means necessary. We see, too, all kinds of well-intentioned people who get manipulated by individuals or corporations or governments through social media or other ways to view the world through a distorted lens. We, too, see some who have become wise to the movements of power in this world and stand firm in their resistance. So while this may not be the Christmas story we prefer or include in our pageants, it does feel like a more realistic account of events. But before succumbing to the temptation of allegory that slams our opponents and validates our own convictions, and while noting these echoes and patterns are consistent across the centuries, let's note it's not the intrigue plots or violence in general, or even for the gain of political power or wealth, but rather, all of this is provoked by the promise of God's coming Messiah and the salvation he will bring. What's so threatening about God's salvation, mercy, and grace? Simply that it is a threat is a stark reminder that we are in the need of that very salvation, mercy, and grace. Fundamentally, it points to the fact that we're not in control, that we, no more than Herod and all of Jerusalem, are terrified to realize we don't have the final say in how the world or our lives, no matter how well planned, will run. Similarly, the wise men had no notion of where their journey of following the star was going to take them. They only knew it was a journey they were called to, and that journey would lead them to a king. Let's also note that what is constant across the centuries is not simply that Jesus creates opposition just by Jesus' existence. The highlight is that he comes in love and mercy, that he comes to save, that he comes for all, leaving out no one who admits their need. And let's note that God's consistent action is to side with the oppressed and save anyone who is humble enough to call out for help. God works through magi, warns in dreams, helps a family take flight. God provides shelter and sanctuary in Egypt. And even as God is really actively at work in this story, very little of it is what the characters in the story would have hoped for or planned. And yet, none of it is devoid of God's presence. God arrives in ways that none of the characters expect, from Herod to the wise men. In fact, I have to wonder, when the wise men arrived, were they disappointed? I know the text says, when the star stopped, they were overwhelmed by joy. I imagine they were delighted to have arrived at a destination and at the prospect of taking a break from camel riding. But Matthew mentions the kings entered the house where Mary and Jesus were. If I were a king, I might be a little surprised to find royalty in a house, not a palace. And surely it wasn't a fancy house, since Jesus was a carpenter. Upon arrival at this humble home, did they have any second thoughts? At least maybe this was not what we were expecting. What did they think about on that long journey home? Something about the wise men and their journey in the midst of all the intrigue and political uncertainty in Matthew, it sparks the imagination. Perhaps in part it's because we know so little about them. Not even their title is clear. They've been called wise men, kings, magi, scholars, just to name a few. Pretty much all we know is that they're learned men of some means who traveled from the east. Matthew isn't even really specific about the location they're coming from. In fact, the story doesn't even mention the number of wise men. It's been centuries of Christians wondering and imagining that only settled on the nice, satisfying number of 3. I think because 2 seems like too few and 5 would crowd the nativity. But those Christians with their imagination also gave them names. If you're wondering, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, and backstories. I can't help but think the reason for the mythology that developed around these wise men is there's something about their story that feels deeply true, deeply human. This sense of journey, of pilgrimage resonates over time. Author and poet David White reflects that a pilgrim is a word that accurately describes the average human being. Someone on their way to somewhere else, but someone never quite knowing whether the destination or the path stands first in importance. Someone dependent on help from absolute strangers and from those who travel with them. Most of all, A pilgrim is someone abroad in a world of impending revelation, where something is about to happen, including, most fearfully, and as part of their eventual arrival, their own disappearance. Perhaps that's why Christians have spent so much time wondering about the wise men. As a child, I thought 34 hours in the car was more than enough time traveling. And though the Bible doesn't state how long the wise men were on their journey, tradition suggests it may have been 2 to 3 years. That would make for a 4 to 6 year journey round trip. A significant time investment and risk. And little did they know it, on their journey they were walking right into the dangerous political uncertainty of the violent King Herod. But here's the thing. The wise men's story is not what they were traveling through, but what they were traveling to. They may not have had agency over all the political forces vying for power in the ancient Near East, but they did have agency over that which set their course. They had the agency to choose the star that they would follow. And that star pointed the way, as it has over centuries, to the God who arrives and is at work in history, even our own history, showing up in the most humble and unexpected of places. The God of grace and love and mercy, strong and powerful to save, but in ways that we would never necessarily anticipate or expect. So this new year, 2021, is not a road trip to nowhere. May God open our eyes to the guiding star so that we may discover the arrival of Jesus, the arrival of love actively at work in the world, in this new year and in the years to come. Happy New Year, everybody. Amen.